The Roman Catholic Lectionary is a rather interesting thing at times. This week, a verse quietly disappeared from the readings for Trinity Sunday, and that omission reveals a lot about moral evolution, generational trauma, and the uncomfortable reality that even religious institutions edit their sacred traditions to match changing human values. The fact is that ancient ideas about inherited punishment eventually collided with growing concepts of compassion and individual accountability. But this isn't just about ancient times, because all of this still matters today as we struggle to break cycles of harm in our own families, communities, and societies. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. One of the things I find genuinely fascinating about organized religion is how often it quietly edits itself while simultaneously insisting that its truths are eternal and unchanging. And honestly, nowhere is that more visible than in the lectionary readings used in many churches. Now, for those unfamiliar, a lectionary is simply a pre-selected schedule of readings, scripture readings, that are used during worship services. It determines which passages get read publicly and which ones mysteriously remain out of sight. Kind of like that weird cousin who eats by himself in front of the TV during Thanksgiving dinner, I guess. This week's reading from Exodus is a perfect example. In the Roman Catholic Lectionary, the reading jumps from Exodus 34, verse 6, directly to verse 8. That seems harmless enough until you realize that verse 7 is doing the theological equivalent of pounding on the locked door it was shoved behind. It's screaming, "Hey, you skipped something important. Don't forget me." So guess what? In this episode of Afterthoughts, we're not going to forget verse 7. We're going to take a close look at it. So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. All right, let's start by reading the omitted verse out loud. Now, in verse 6, God told Moses, and this was God speaking, God told Moses, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God. God speaks about himself in the third person, I guess. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And verse 7 continues with this, continuing his love for 1,000 generations, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet not declaring the guilty guiltless, but bringing punishment for their parents' wickedness on children and children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And it ends with an exclamation point. Ah, yes, there it is. The part where children and grandchildren, 4 generations of folks, get punished for something they didn't do. Funny how that didn't quite make the cut for the Trinity Sunday readings. God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and then punished your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren because of some stupid shit that you did. Now, to be fair, religious traditions have always shaped and curated scripture readings for practical reasons. No matter what anyone thinks, no church service wants to become a 4-hour dramatic reading of genealogies and livestock regulations. But the verses that get omitted, well, they often tell us something important about changing human values. Modern Christians generally believe punishing children for the sins of their parents, well, that's morally wrong. Most people, they instinctively cringe at the idea of inherited guilt. And because of that moral discomfort, religious institutions, well, they usually soften, contextualize, reinterpret, or just avoid passages that no longer align with contemporary ethical instincts. From a humanist perspective, well, this is incredibly revealing. It suggests that morality is not flowing downward, unchanged from heaven, handed to humans. No, human beings are the ones that are constantly wrestling with inherited traditions. They're refining their ethics. They're updating their understanding of justice and compassion, and they're doing it over time, sometimes throughout generations. In other words, even sacred traditions evolve because people evolve. And honestly, I think that's a damn good thing. Now, before we completely dunk on Exodus 34, verse 7, we should try to understand the world it came from. In the ancient Near East, people didn't think about individuality the way modern Western societies do. Identity was basically collective. Family, tribe, nation, those mattered more than personal autonomy. If one generation made catastrophic decisions about war, corruption, exploitation, idolatry, whatever, the consequences, well, they naturally spilled onto their children and grandchildren. And honestly, there's a practical truth buried in that observation. Look, if parents destroy a family financially, emotionally, or socially, their children, well, they often inherit the fallout. If leaders drive a nation into collapse, future generations suffer. Ancient people looked around and saw that actions echo through time. So when they described God visiting iniquity upon future generations, they were partly describing a social reality that they just observed every day. Some theologians also argue that the verse was trying to emphasize accountability rather than cruelty. Now, in this interpretation, well, God refuses to simply wave away injustice and pretend harmful actions don't matter. The idea is that wrongdoing damages relationships and communities, and restoration requires confronting that damage honestly. Okay, that's a much more generous reading than God enjoys punishing toddlers because Grandpa was an asshole. But I don't know that I buy it. But even within the passage itself, there's still a bit of tension. Verse 6, I read both of the verses. Verse 6 describes God as compassionate and merciful. And in the original Hebrew, it uses language that's rooted in the Hebrew word rakhum, which is related to the word for womb. And the imagery, it's deeply parental. It's very nurturing. Compassion here, it's not some abstract politeness. It's very, very visceral care. It's protective love. It's the instinct to shelter and sustain vulnerable life. All right, so that's what's coming out of verse 6. That's what makes the passage feel so conflicted, because on the one hand, there's all this mercy flowing from this parental-like compassion. And then in the next breath, there's all this shit about inherited punishment extending across generations to the third and fourth generation. The text itself feels like it's wrestling with competing understandings of justice, which, honestly, that sounds pretty human, because humans are constantly trying to balance accountability and compassion. We want harmful actions to matter, but we also don't want to resort to flat-out cruelty. We want justice, but we instinctively know that endless punishment creates far more suffering. It doesn't create healing. The Bible often reflects that struggle because the Bible is not one voice descending untouched from the heavens. The Bible is many generations of human beings wrestling with morality, power, suffering, survival, and meaning. And once you start noticing that, I think the whole book becomes a lot more interesting. One of the biggest myths about the Bible is the idea that it speaks with one perfectly unified voice. This is something that modern evangelical Christians especially, and Christian nationalists, I suppose, seem to get behind. Right? Scholars use the word univocal for that concept, meaning speaking with one voice. That the Bible, everything in the Bible is perfectly in alignment and speaks with one voice. But the Bible is very much not univocal. The Bible contains disagreements, reversals, reinterpretations. It has evolving moral frameworks that are spread across centuries of authorship. And Exodus chapter 34, verse 7 gives us a perfect example because several centuries later, the prophet Ezekiel comes along during the Babylonian exile and basically says, yeah, we need to revisit this whole generational punishment thing. In Ezekiel 18, he explicitly rejects the old proverb that children suffer for the parents' sins. Ezekiel declares, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father. Look, folks, that's not a minor clarification. That is a direct theological correction. Ezekiel was speaking to people who were living through a national catastrophe. Jerusalem had fallen. Families were displaced. People, they believed they were doomed because of the failures of previous generations. And Ezekiel's message, it was radical for its time. Ezekiel told the people, look, you're not permanently condemned because of your ancestors' mistakes. You still have agency. You can choose differently. Now that change matters enormously because it shows moral evolution happening inside the Bible itself. Ancient writers revisited older ideas and said, actually, we think justice works differently than that. Now, think about what that means for a moment. If ancient prophets could reinterpret or overturn earlier theological assumptions in pursuit of greater justice and more compassion, that means moral growth is not rebellion against the Bible or rebellion against tradition. Moral growth is part of the tradition itself. And honestly, we still do this constantly today. Religious communities reinterpret Scripture regarding slavery, women's rights, democracy, religious freedom, divorce, mental health, LGBTQ folks. Human understanding evolves. So we reinterpret things. We reinterpret Scripture because human understanding evolves. Our interpretation evolves. The embarrassing part is not that moral evolution happens. The embarrassing part is pretending it doesn't happen while quietly editing the readings and hoping nobody notices that verse 7 is sitting over there awkwardly in the corner. From a humanist perspective, this is not evidence that morality is meaningless, right? It's evidence that morality requires continual reflection and learning and empathy and ongoing revision. We don't become more ethical by freezing ancient ideas in place forever. We become more ethical and more moral by remaining willing to challenge harmful assumptions as our understanding grows. That process is messy. It's slow, it's imperfect, but honestly, so is humanity. Now, here's where all of this becomes even more relevant to modern life. Most humanists don't believe in literal, supernatural, generational curses. But we absolutely recognize generational trauma. We know abuse echoes through families. Addiction echoes through families. Poverty, violence, emotional neglect, racism, authoritarianism, untreated mental illness, they all ripple across generations when they're left unaddressed. In that sense, Exodus 34, verse 7 accidentally stumbles onto something painfully real. Unresolved harm spreads. A parent's rage becomes a child's anxiety. A generation's silence on something becomes another generation's emotional dysfunction. Communities that normalize cruelty, they often reproduce cruelty. Entire societies inherit systems built on exploitation and injustice long after the original architects are dead. But unlike the ancient worldview, we're not required to treat those cycles as destiny. That's the crucial difference. Human flourishing depends on people deciding to interrupt destructive patterns instead of just inheriting them passively. And honestly, that connects beautifully to this week's theme of service. Real service is not just kindness in isolated moments. It's the exhausting work of helping repair damaged systems, relationships, and communities so that future generations don't continue carrying the same wounds. Sometimes service means therapy. Sometimes it means apologizing. Sometimes it means confronting addiction honestly. Sometimes it means breaking cycles of violence and prejudice and manipulation or emotional neglect that are going on inside of families. Sometimes service means building healthier communities than the ones we inherited. And that work is hard because generational patterns, they're sticky. They're hard to break free from. Human beings instinctively normalize whatever they grew up around. People often reproduce the very systems that hurt them because familiarity feels safer than the scariness of change, which is why moral growth always requires conscious effort. The lectionary skipped verse 7 because it makes modern people uncomfortable. But honestly, I think discomfort can be useful. Difficult passages force us to ask hard questions about the kinds of consequences we're still passing along to future generations. What unresolved harm are we normalizing? What patterns are we unconsciously repeating? What systems are we preserving because, that's just the way things are done? And perhaps, most importantly, what would it look like for us to become the generation that finally decides to stop handing certain forms of suffering down the line? Because maybe the real lesson hidden inside all of this ancient mythology isn't about divine punishment at all. Maybe it's about responsibility. The responsibility to recognize how deeply interconnected human lives really are. The responsibility to build healthier systems than the ones we inherited. And the responsibility to choose compassion, accountability, and repair over things like cynicism and fatalism. We can't change the past, but we absolutely influence the future. And every act of healing, of honesty, of service, and restoration becomes part of the long human project of breaking cycles that used to seem inevitable. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at the Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for each age group. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. It provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.